He was old, alone, and no one expected him to care. They called him Ghost, not because he was white or silent, but because he seemed to belong to another world. A world before the fences, before the rescue center, before the pain. He had no herd, no mate, no name that he remembered, just scars, faded ones on his back, fresh ones on his tusks, and a look in his eyes that made even the boldest rangers lower their gaze. For years, he roamed the farthest corners of the sanctuary, never close to the gates, never among the others. He didn't trumpet, he didn't charge, he just walked, slowly, as if searching for something that had long since vanished. No one knew his full story. Some said he had escaped a circus fire. Others whispered he had once led a herd until poachers took everything but his breath. Whatever the truth was, Ghost never came near the calves, not when they cried, not when they played, not even when they died. He stayed in the shadows until that one morning. The sun had barely risen, casting pale gold light across the trees when the call came through the radio. We found a collapsed calf, looks barely a month old, breathing but shallow. She was found near the marsh, alone, legs trembling, eyes sunken with dehydration. Her skin was scraped, dusted with blood, and her tiny trunk barely moved as the rescuers knelt beside her. No mother in sight, no herd nearby, just silence, thick and heavy. They named her Aya, which means miracle, in a language older than the forest. But even a miracle needs more than hope. The vets did all they could. IV fluids, wrapped blankets, warm milk. But Aya wouldn't respond. She didn't lift her head, didn't open her eyes. The faint flutter in her chest was growing fainter. The rangers knew the signs. They had seen this before, and it almost always ended the same way. So they called in backup. Not more medicine, not more machines, but instinct. They opened the gates to the adult enclosures. Let the others smell her, approach if they wanted. Some came near, sniffed, walked away. Most didn't even glance, except for him, Ghost. No one saw when he entered, but when they looked back, he was already there, standing silently beside her, trunk hovering just inches from her curled body, not touching, just listening. His ears twitched, his breath shallow, and then, without warning, he dropped to his knees beside her. Rangers froze. He hadn't lain down in over 3 years, not once. And yet now, here he was, curled around a dying calf like she was his own. No one knew what to do. No one dared to move, because what happened next was something no one expected. For hours, no one moved. Rangers watched from a distance, whispering into radios, cameras quietly recording what they all knew was unprecedented. Ghost had always avoided the sick, the young, the vulnerable, perhaps because they reminded him of something he once had, or worse, something he failed to protect. And yet here he was, wrapped around Aya like a sentry made of stone and memory. He didn't trumpet, didn't touch her with force. He simply stayed, his massive body forming a shield against the rising wind, his breath falling in rhythm with hers, as if trying to lend her the strength she had lost. The morning passed into afternoon. Aya didn't wake. The vets suggested pulling him away to reduce stress, but the senior ranger, a woman who had been with the sanctuary since its founding, shook her head. "If he's doing this on his own," she whispered, "we let him finish." And so they waited and watched. And as the second night began to fall, something shifted. Aya moved, just slightly, her trunk curled around one of Ghost's front legs, not with urgency, but with familiarity, like a memory half remembered. Ghost didn't react, not at first, but then he did something that made every single person holding their breath finally exhale. He rumbled, a low, guttural sound that vibrated through the earth itself, a sound elephants use when calling their young. But Ghost hadn't called to anyone in years. The sound stirred something in Aya. She tried to lift her head but collapsed again, too weak. Still, her ears twitched. She had heard him. She had heard someone. That night, the rescue team placed a heat lamp nearby, but left the rest to Ghost. He didn't move from her side, not when the insects swarmed, not when the temperatures dropped. not even when thunder cracked over the hills. By the third morning, Aya opened her eyes, and the first thing she saw was him. Not the vets, not the rangers, not the world around her, but Ghost, still beside her, still breathing slow and steady, still waiting. She lifted her trunk again, this time reaching toward his tusk, as if tracing the curve of survival itself. And he let her, no flinching, no avoidance. Only stillness, deep and patient, like the roots of the baobab trees that had stood through centuries. After that, everything changed. Ghost began guiding her, gently, slowly. Each day they walked a little farther from the site where she had fallen. He stayed close, always on her weaker side, always between her and the shadows. When other elephants approached, curious and uncertain, Ghost stepped forward, not with aggression, but with the presence of one who had once led and still remembered how. And for reasons no one could explain, the others backed away, not out of fear, but reverence. Within 2 weeks, Aya was eating on her own. Her limp faded, her eyes brightened. She began to mimic Ghost's movements, how he picked up food, how he moved branches, how he paused when the wind shifted direction. And Ghost, who had once kept his distance from everything and everyone, now shared space. Not just with Aya, but with the herd. Some rangers called it a miracle. Others called it instinct. But those who had been there long enough knew better. This was grief transformed. This was loneliness answered. This was something that didn't fit into charts or research papers or wildlife documentaries. This was a bond forged not by blood or biology, but by something older, deeper. They discovered later, through a series of old photos from confiscated camp files, that Ghost had once had a calf. A baby born in captivity, likely lost in a poacher raid, never found. She looked eerily similar to Aya, same fold in the ear, same wrinkle on the upper trunk. It was impossible to know for sure, but perhaps Ghost remembered, or perhaps his body remembered, even if his mind could no longer piece together the loss. Regardless, one truth became clear. Aya was alive because of him. Not the medicine, not the monitoring, not even the sanctuary itself, but because a lonely, scarred bull elephant who had given up on connection chose to stay. And that choice changed everything. The sanctuary had always been a place of healing, but healing had a rhythm, a system, a protocol. Ghost ignored all of it. He taught Aya not by teaching, but by existing, by showing that survival wasn't always loud, that strength wasn't always in size or speed, but sometimes in the simple act of not walking away. His presence disrupted the ordinary. Rangers who once cataloged behaviors now stood in silence, watching moments they couldn't quite explain. He wasn't just helping a calf recover, he was redefining what connection meant in a world where pain had taught so many to retreat. Aya, once the dying calf no one expected to live past sunrise, became a mirror. Through her, they saw what Ghost had buried beneath the scars. Through him, they saw what she could become. And through both, something shifted across the sanctuary. Other elephants, once cautious, territorial, aloof, began to draw closer. It was subtle at first, a younger female grazing nearer than usual, a subadult bull matching Ghost's pace at a respectful distance. And then one day, without warning, Ghost led Aya into the communal bathing pool, something he had never done with any herd. No one dared to interrupt, not when Aya splashed for the first time, not when Ghost rumbled softly in response, not when, for the briefest moment, he lifted his trunk to the sky, not in warning, not in mourning, but in what could only be called joy. It was the first time anyone had seen him do that, and it wasn't the last, because Ghost, the loner, the outcast, the ghost in name and in spirit, had become something no one expected, a leader. Not by dominance, not by demand, but by example. His story traveled beyond the sanctuary. Volunteers who had once only come to take pictures now came to stay longer, to understand. Researchers revised their assumptions. Visitors cried quietly behind the observation glass. And more than once, those who had lost something, family, faith, themselves, found a strange sense of peace just watching him move through the trees beside a calf he wasn't supposed to care about. Ghost never asked for attention. He didn't need a nameplate or a title. He didn't reclaim the center of the herd. He simply stayed where he was needed, when he was needed, doing what few had the courage to do, show up and remain. And perhaps that was what made all the difference, because in a world that celebrates power and noise, his quiet defiance stood taller than any trumpet. Aya grew stronger each day. Her steps became confident. Her ears, once drooping from exhaustion, now perked with curiosity. And as she matured, she never strayed far from him. Even when other calves invited her to play, she always glanced back to see where he was. And he always watched, not possessively, not anxiously, but with a kind of peace that only comes from knowing your presence matters. By the end of that year, Aya was healthy, playful, and curious. But Ghost had slowed, not in spirit, but in body. His steps were more deliberate, his rests more frequent. The rangers noticed, but didn't intervene. They knew some rhythms couldn't be rushed. And when the time came, on a quiet morning with mist still curling over the hills, Ghost laid down near the same grove where he had first wrapped himself around Aya. This time, he didn't rise, but Aya did. She stood beside him, not crying, not pacing, just standing, breathing, listening. And then gently she touched his tusk with her trunk, like she had done the day she first woke up. A circle completed. The other elephants gathered, slowly, respectfully, surrounding the spot like a hush settling over the earth. There was no panic, no noise, only stillness. Ghost had gone, but not silently. Because his silence had become something else entirely. It had become legacy. Not the kind carved in stone or written in reports, but the kind that lingers in the way others move, in the pauses between footsteps, in the choices made when no one is watching. Ghost's legacy wasn't about grandeur. It wasn't even about memory. It was about impact. Quiet, rippling impact that traveled farther than anyone could measure. Aya grew up with that legacy woven into her bones. She became a matriarch not by age, but by presence. She watched over younger calves with the same silent protection she had once received. She stepped forward when others hesitated. She stayed when others turned away. And though she never rumbled as loudly as the bulls or trumpeted with the same fury as the elders, she was always heard, because those who had known Ghost listened differently now. Visitors would ask, "Which one is Aya?" And when they saw her, they expected to see a mark, some scar, some symbol of her near-death past. But Aya wore none. What she carried couldn't be seen. It lived in the way she touched her trunk to the smallest calves when they cried, in how she lingered near the old, the limping, the lonely, in how she turned toward the forgotten corners of the sanctuary, as if looking for a shadow that once walked beside her. Ghost may have vanished into the forest floor, but the path he carved never closed. Rangers began to speak differently, not about dominance, but about empathy, not about hierarchy, but about care. And the sanctuary itself evolved. They stopped labeling certain elephants as non-integrated or unfit for herds, because Ghost had taught them that sometimes healing starts where labels end, and far beyond that forest, across continents, through screens and stories, his quiet act of staying reached people who had forgotten how much it mattered to simply not walk away. Letters came in from children who read about Ghost in school books. Donations poured in from strangers who had lost someone but found peace in watching his story. A mural appeared on the outer wall of the sanctuary, not of Ghost charging or trumpeting, but lying down beside Aya, eyes closed, breath steady. It became a place where visitors left notes, prayers, and silent promises to live with more gentleness. Because Ghost hadn't just saved Aya, he had reminded the world what love without condition looks like. That compassion doesn't need an audience. That presence, quiet, unwavering, and uncelebrated, is sometimes the most powerful force in existence. And perhaps most of all, he reminded us that sometimes the ones who seem the most broken are the ones capable of the most extraordinary healing, not just of themselves, but of others. Because something shifted after Ghost chose to stay. Not just in Aya, not just in the herd, but in the people watching. Rangers who once moved from duty to duty with hardened hearts found themselves pausing longer at the enclosures. The vet who used to focus on numbers, temperature, pulse, hydration, began to linger after each checkup, whispering soft words of encouragement no animal could understand, but every soul could feel. The change was quiet, almost imperceptible, like water softening stone. But it was there. One young ranger, barely out of training, started writing in a notebook each evening. Not stats, but moments. Ghost blinked longer when Aya nuzzled him. Aya didn't eat until he took the first bite. They stood side by side for 20 minutes without moving, just listening. What began as observation slowly became reflection. A way to remember that even the smallest gestures, especially the smallest gestures, held weight, and it didn't stop with them. New elephants brought into the sanctuary seemed to sense something different. Even the most traumatized bulls, those who had been beaten, broken, and betrayed, watched Aya and Ghost from a distance. Some crept closer, one cautious step at a time. Others merely listened, but all of them knew something sacred was unfolding. Not a hierarchy, not a dominance, a communion, a language beyond sound, beyond species, built on the simple truth that we are not meant to suffer alone. Even the land responded. The grove where Ghost had laid beside Aya, once dry and hardened from trampling, began to flourish. Rangers planted nothing. They cleared nothing. And yet, weeks later, wildflowers sprouted. Birds nested in the nearby trees. The wind moved more softly through the leaves. Locals from nearby villages began calling it the Silent Heart. Not because it was quiet, but because it listened. And Ghost, he listened too. To the breath of calves curled beside their mothers, to the shifting weight of elephants who once knew only chains, to the rhythm of a world that had hurt him and healed him in equal measure. He never claimed space, never reclaimed a role. He just walked beside those who needed walking. And when they stumbled, he waited. When they cried, he didn't respond with sound. He responded by staying. Even humans who visited the sanctuary, many who arrived only to take photos or check a box, left changed. One man, a corporate executive from the city, stood at the edge of the grove and wept openly when he saw Ghost nudge a limping calf toward a pile of hay. "I didn't know they could feel like this," he whispered. He didn't mean elephants. He meant himself. And perhaps that was the quiet magic Ghost had carried all along. Not just a capacity to endure his suffering, but a capacity to transform it. To turn loss into protection, loneliness into connection, and silence into something powerful enough to move even the most guarded hearts. Ghost had become more than a survivor. He had become a guide, not by teaching others what to do, but by showing them how to be. And Aya, still growing, still learning, followed that example with every breath. She didn't become the strongest or the fastest. She became something better, the one who stayed, just as he had, the one who waited when others ran, the one who leaned in when others pulled back. And in doing so, she wasn't just honoring him, she was extending him, living proof that the best parts of us don't vanish when we're gone. They continue in every kindness, in every pause, in every life touched by a presence that refused to disappear. Because some presences are not bound by breath or body. They linger, woven into the fibers of the places they touched, etched into the rhythms of those they loved. Ghost was no longer seen walking between the trees, but his absence had its own gravity. A hush would fall over the sanctuary when the wind rustled through the grove where he had last laid down. The elephants, especially the youngest ones, would pause when they passed it, as if feeling something that couldn't be named, but was deeply known. And Aya had begun to walk differently. She no longer followed. She led. Not with command or force, but with a gentleness that drew others close. When calves cried at night, she was the one who stood nearest. When a new arrival trembled in the corner of the enclosure, she approached slowly, stopping just short of touch, and waited. Sometimes for minutes, sometimes for hours, until the other elephant chose to move toward her. She never rushed it, just like Ghost never rushed her. The rangers noticed it too. She had picked up habits no one had taught her. She'd stand on the western side of young calves during the hottest part of the day, Ghost's old position when shielding her from the sun. She'd take the same path to the watering hole he used to take, stopping to smell the bark of the same 3 acacia trees he once paused beneath. She never played like the other young ones, but when she looked at them, there was no bitterness, only something softer, as if she knew the world didn't owe her joy, but still chose to find it anyway. Even the herd dynamics began to shift. Conflicts that once flared between bulls started fading. Older females, once dominant and quick to push others aside, became less rigid in Aya's presence. It was as if the entire sanctuary, consciously or not, had agreed to walk a little slower, breathe a little deeper, listen a little more. And perhaps the most powerful thing of all? Aya never trumpeted, not once in those early months after Ghost's passing. Instead, she rumbled, quietly, deeply. Often at dusk, when the light turned gold and the trees stretched long shadows across the grass. A sound so low, so grounded, that it seemed to come from the earth itself. Some said she was calling for him. Others said she was speaking like he did. But those who knew better. She wasn't calling out, she was answering. Answering a presence that refused to disappear, a love that refused to die, and a lesson that would outlive them both. That you don't need to speak to be heard, don't need to lead to guide, don't need to survive everything to help someone else begin again. Because Ghost's gift wasn't just his loyalty, it wasn't his patience. It wasn't even the miracle of saving a calf on the brink of death. His gift was remembrance, a kind of memory that didn't live in the mind, but in the muscle, in instinct, in motion, in stillness. A memory that passed from one heartbeat to another, like a torch handed not in ceremony, but in silence. One that burned not with fire, but with meaning. And that's how he remained. Not as a legend told in ranger stories, not as a name scratched into a plaque, but in the way Aya turned her head when the wind picked up. In the way calves no longer feared the dark edges of the enclosure. In the way every elephant paused just for a breath when walking past the grove. Ghost had vanished, but everything he had been stayed. He had vanished, but everything he had been stayed. And now years later, when new calves arrive, frightened and shaking, when storms rage across the hills and silence drapes the sanctuary like a second skin, the rangers know where to look. They look for Aya, because Aya still walks the path Ghost once carved, not in his shadow, but with his strength. She moves gently, but with purpose. She pauses by the same grove where he first chose to stay, trunk raised as if to feel the echo of his breath in the wind. And those who see her, truly see her, don't ask what happened anymore. They ask what they can do, because Ghost's legacy wasn't made of monuments or names engraved in stone. It was made of lives continued, of pain not repeated, of silence broken, and the sanctuary, now quiet under a canopy of eucalyptus trees, holds more than just animals. It holds memory, it holds presence, it holds a promise that no calf will ever be left alone again, that no breath will go unnoticed, that every act of staying, of witnessing, can become the reason someone else gets to begin. Ghost's story did not end in sorrow. It became the soil from which new lives would rise. And if this story moved you, even for a moment, don't let it end here. Speak up, share his name, learn where your choices echo, because staying matters, even when no one's watching, especially then. If this story moved you, don't let it fade. Share it, speak for him. Let Ghost's choice echo through yours.